Right now, as you lie in the deepening stillness of the night, there may be a sensation behind your breastbone that feels like a cold, unyielding stone. It is not necessarily a sharp pain, but rather a dense, heavy flatness, a quiet numbness that seems to absorb all your warmth. Perhaps you came to this space tonight carrying a profound, unexplained fatigue, a weariness so deep in your bones that no amount of ordinary sleep seems able to touch it. You might find yourself moving through your days feeling somewhat detached, as though you are watching your life happen from behind a thick pane of frosted glass. You smile when you are supposed to smile, you fulfill your obligations, and you keep moving forward, yet underneath it all, you feel strangely hollow, as if the emotional landscape inside you has gone completely grey. Maybe you have spent months, or even years, holding back an ancient reservoir of sadness or loss, keeping it tightly packed down in the dark out of a hidden, terrifying whisper that if you ever allow yourself to truly feel it, the crying will never stop, or the weight will break you entirely. Let yourself sink slowly into the soft embrace of your bed, allowing the mattress to fully accept the burden of your physical frame. The room around you is softly dimming now, the frantic speed of the daylight hours dissolving into the quiet corners of the night. Feel the gentle, grounding weight of your blanket as it rests across your shoulders and chest, creating a safe, protective boundary between you and the endless demands of the world outside. Through the window, a pale, quiet sliver of moonlight catches the edge of the floorboards, completely motionless, asking nothing from the space it illuminates. The distant sounds of the neighborhood are beginning to grow faint, turning into a low, harmless murmur that gradually drifts away into the dark. As you rest your head against the pillow, notice the cool night air as it brushes against your skin, carrying away the lingering friction of everything you had to endure today. With each slow, natural rise and fall of your chest, invite the small muscles around your temples and your eyes to uncoil, letting your body soften into the heavy warmth of this moment. Dear friend, right now, please hear these words. You are not broken. What you are feeling in the center of your chest tonight is not a failure of your character, nor is it a sign that you are weak. This very numbness, this heavy stone you carry behind your breastbone, is not a structural defect. It is a protection mechanism that your heart constructed when the world became too cold to bear. It was an act of survival, but tonight, we are not going to force your mind to become perfectly silent, and we are not going to aggressively demand that you force your tears to flow. Fighting your own numbness only creates a harder wall. Tonight, we do not have to solve your whole life, and you do not have to fix a single broken thing before you are permitted to rest. We are simply going to learn how to sit with this internal winter, changing our relationship with the cold space inside, discovering that you are safe enough to finally let your guard down. The mind does not find genuine healing because it successfully builds an absolute shield against sadness. It finds peace when it realizes that suppressing our grief does not protect us, but rather preserves the very weight that exhausts our spirit. We often believe that if we keep our emotional gates locked, if we remain numb and refuse to look at the old hurts, we can keep ourselves functional and strong. But this defensive shielding holds a profound paradox. It is like a traveler who recovers a dense black block of wood charcoal from an ancient hearth fire. Because the traveler was terrified that the residual heat of the old fire would burn down his house, he buried the charcoal deep under wet mountain soil, soaking it in cold water to smother the embers completely. Over time, because the charcoal remains buried in the damp earth, it becomes completely waterlogged. It turns into a cold, heavy lump of dense black fiber that can no longer radiate warmth, cannot catch a spark, and cannot complete its natural cycle of turning into light, breathable ash. It simply sits in the dark as a stagnant, freezing weight, staining the hands of anyone who touches it. The traveler thinks he has saved himself from the fire, but he has actually trapped himself with a permanent, cold burden that consumes his strength day after day. Have you felt this water-soaked charcoal inside your own body? Have you kept your old losses and unshed tears buried so deeply in the damp earth of your subconscious, hoping to shield yourself from the pain of looking at them, only to find that the burying itself is what keeps your chest feeling cold, heavy, and perpetually empty? If it feels right, take a slow, unhurried breath in through your nose, letting the cool air travel all the way down into the deeper spaces of your abdomen, and then let it slip out of your mouth with a long, soft, unrestricted sigh. There is no need to force your breathing to match any artificial pace. Just let your body breathe itself, remembering that nothing is required of you in this quiet room. You do not need to perform resilience tonight. You do not need to pretend that you are okay. You are safe enough right now to simply be a tired human being who has carried a heavy weight for a very long distance. One of the great, comforting insights of the Buddha was the understanding that our emotional pain becomes suffering only when the mind adds the secondary layer of resistance and judgment to it. The Buddha pointed out that when we experience a loss or a deep disappointment, it is as if we have been struck by a single arrow. That first arrow is the natural pain of living, the grief of an ending, the sting of a betrayal, or the sorrow of saying goodbye to what we love. It hurts, and it is meant to hurt because our hearts are soft and alive. But when we refuse to let that sadness move, when we lock it away in the dark and tell ourselves we must never show vulnerability, we are striking ourselves with a second arrow. The chronic numbness you feel, the sense of being emotionally flat, the deep fatigue that sleeps cannot fix, this is the second arrow. We wound ourselves by keeping the charcoal wet and buried, believing the numbness is our protection, when the numbness is actually what is freezing our vitality from the inside out. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the nature of this hidden frost. We will journey deep into a water-dripping cedar ravine during a misty spring twilight, where an old charcoal burner showed a very tired young man exactly what happens when we try to survive by smothering our own internal warmth. But before we walk down that misty mountain path, let your jaw loosen slightly. Separate your teeth, release the small muscles around the corners of your mouth, and allow your head to sink completely into the pillow, letting go of the need to understand or analyze everything perfectly as we begin to listen. Deep within a water-dripping cedar ravine, where the cliffs rose high and jagged into the grey sky, the air smelled constantly of wet moss and old bark. In this remote pass, tucked beneath a rocky ledge that wept streams of cold mountain water, stood a solitary, primitive clay kiln. This was the dwelling of Master Tan, an old, stooped charcoal burner whose face was lined like the grain of weathered cedar, and whose hands were perpetually dark from the fine soot of his trade. Master Tan spoke very little, his voice a low grunt that sounded like wood settling under ash. But he possessed an extraordinary stillness, moving through the damp forest with a quiet intent that left the earth virtually undisturbed beneath his feet. To this cold, dripping ravine came Jiro, a young man fleeing the ashes of a great personal tragedy. Jiro had recently lost his ancestral home and his entire family to a sudden, catastrophic valley fire. He had arrived at the pass with nothing but the clothes on his back, his posture rigid as an iron rod, his eyes wide and unblinking. Yet, what was most striking about Jiro was his absolute silence. While other refugees wept openly or cried out in despair, Jiro did not shed a single tear. His face was a frozen mask of iron resolve. He took a strange, fierce pride in this coldness, believing that by locking his grief away in the dark, by refusing to let his heart soften even for a second, he was proving his strength and protecting himself from ever being broken again. He had built a fortress of absolute numbness inside his breastbone, and he intended to live there forever. Master Tan accepted Jiro's presence without asking for his story, assigning him the slow, heavy labor of gathering green cedar boughs and wet earth to pack over the wood trenches. Every evening, as the misty spring twilight deepened and the damp chill rose from the creek bed, Jiro would sit on a flat stone near the cooling kilns. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a sharp ache pulsed rhythmically in his temples. He would watch the black smoke drift into the cedar canopy, and a profound, suffocating emptiness would settle behind his ribs. He felt completely hollow, like an old tree whose core had been hollowed out by rot, yet his muscles remained desperately tight, braced against an invisible blow that he believed was always about to fall. One evening, as a heavy cold mist settled into the ravine, turning the tops of the cedars into faint grey ghosts, Jiro sat by the edge of a completely cold, inactive earth kiln. His fingers were wrapped tightly around his own knees, his chest locked in that shallow, restricted pattern that had become his only way of breathing. Master Tan walked slowly out of the shadows, carrying a coarse hemp storage sack over his shoulder. He stopped before Jiro, his boots crunching softly on the wet gravel, and looked down at the young man's frozen posture. Without saying a word, Master Tan knelt into the damp soil. He reached his dark, calloused hands deep into the base of the old kiln, moving aside a layer of wet black earth. From the dark, dripping recess, he pulled out a massive, heavy block of hearth charcoal. It was a dense piece of wood fiber that had been preserved from a fire lit many months ago. Because it had been buried deep beneath the wet mountain soil to smother the old flames, it had spent half a year absorbing the constant weeping moisture of the ravine. Master Tan held the large block out toward Jiro. "Take this," the old man murmured, his voice cutting through the steady drip of the trees. Jiro reached out his hands, expecting the light, brittle texture of ordinary charcoal. Instead, as his fingers closed around the black block, his arms dropped an inch from the unexpected weight. The charcoal was incredibly dense, ice-cold to the touch, and completely saturated with water. It felt like holding a block of river iron. As Jiro held it, the dark, stagnant water within the wood began to seep out, mixing with the fine black soot and leaving thick, cold streaks across his palms and wrists. Jiro looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion, his breath short. "It is incredibly heavy, Master," Jiro whispered, his voice shaking slightly from the cold, "and it is completely wet." Master Tan leaned back on his heels, his grey eyes steady in the fading light. He reached out and tapped the dense block with his knuckle. It made a dull, thudding sound, completely devoid of resonance. "This charcoal came from a great oak tree that grew on the ridge," Tan said softly. "When the old fire burned, the keepers became terrified that the sparks would catch the entire forest. So they threw mounds of wet mountain dirt over the hearth, soaking the embers in cold water until the smoke died completely. They thought they were preserving the wood. They thought they were saving its utility." The old man paused, letting the sound of the dripping creek fill the space between them. "But look at what it has become now, Jiro," Master Tan continued, his voice dropping into a lower, gentler register. "Because it has remained buried in the damp earth, closed away from the sun and the movement of the wind, it has become completely waterlogged. It cannot catch a new spark. It cannot radiate warmth to a freezing traveler. It cannot complete its natural life by turning into light, weightless ash that returns to the soil. It simply sits here in the dark as a cold, stagnant burden, staining everything it touches. The keepers saved it from the fire, but they trapped it in a permanent winter." Master Tan reached out and gently placed his hand over Jiro's wrists, which were straining to hold the heavy, waterlogged block. He did not pull the charcoal away. He simply let his warmth rest against Jiro's cold skin until Jiro's white knuckles began to loosen, his fingers slowly relaxing their fierce grip. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the nature of the frost we carry in our own minds. Master Tan guided Jiro's hands down until the heavy block of charcoal was resting flat upon the damp gravel between them. The moment the weight left Jiro's hands, a strange, sudden tremor ran through the young man's chest. "You have come to this ravine carrying a block of water-soaked charcoal right behind your breastbone, Jiro," the old charcoal burner whispered. "When your home burned, when your life was torn away from you, your heart experienced a heat that was too intense to bear. You became terrified of that burning pain that you threw down a heavy layer of numbness. You smothered your own tears, froze your own grief, and vowed never to let your heart feel warm or vulnerable again. You believe this coldness is your strength. You think that by remaining flat and empty, you are keeping yourself safe from the next disaster." Jiro looked down at his black-stained hands, his chest beginning to heave slightly as the cold air hit his throat. "But look at your life, Jiro," Master Tan said with infinite tenderness. "Your numbness is not a shield. It is this heavy, waterlogged weight. You are preserving your grief by freezing it in place, by refusing to let your sadness move, by locking your tears in the dark earth of your body. You have trapped yourself in a cold tomb where nothing can grow and nothing can heal. The immense fatigue you feel tonight is not caused by the labor of the forest. It is the exhaustion of carrying a mountain of unshed tears." A deep, trembling silence fell over the cedar ravine, heavier than the mist that hung in the branches. Jiro stared at the dark, wet block of charcoal resting on the earth. He looked at the black streaks on his skin, then felt the cold, hard stone that had been sitting behind his ribs for so long. For the first time in his life, he saw his internal coldness not as a victory of discipline, but as a slow, suffocating decay. He had been so busy surviving the fire that he had turned his own heart into a stagnant, frozen swamp. He felt a sharp, sudden crack in the armor around his ribs, a sensation of immense heaviness that wanted to drop, yet he did not know how to let it fall. Master Tan reached into his hemp sack and pulled out a clean, dry cloth. He did not try to force Jiro to change his expression, nor did he offer empty words of comfort. He simply began to wipe the black soot from the young man's cold fingers, his movements steady, slow, and entirely unhurried. "Don't leave the charcoal on the ground tonight, Jiro," the old man said quietly. "It has been in the mud for too long. Tomorrow we will lift it out into the wind, and we will let the air show us what happens when we stop hiding our wood from the sky. Don't let yourself rest in the stillness of this canyon for a moment, letting the imagery of that damp, quiet ravine sink down into your own body. Feel the specific weight you have been holding behind your own breastbone all day long, the cold, buried sorrow you have kept hidden out of fear that it would consume you if it ever came to light. There is no need to resolve that grief right now. You can simply let it rest on the earth beneath you, allowing your hands to become empty as we listen. This story is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold and unmoving like the stone walls of the canyon outpost. It is not an invitation to decouple ourselves from our responsibilities, our deep relationships, or the quiet goals we hold for our futures. Buddhist wisdom does not seek to transform the human spirit into a frozen desert where nothing moves and nothing matters. Instead, it is revealing to us something much softer, an entirely different way of being alive that does not require us to choke out our own vitality in order to remain safe. When we look closely at Harus' long journey through the freezing ravines, we see that his true suffering was not caused by the bitter winter weather, nor was it caused by the difficult memory of old betrayals. The wind was simply moving through the pass. The past was simply a series of events that had already come and gone. The real, crushing suffering lived entirely in the way his mind held those memories in the present. It was the invisible tight clenching of his own inner armor that turned his need for emotional safety into a heavy, frozen torture. He was carrying the potential threat of tomorrow's disappointment so intensely that he had locked his entire life behind a rusted barrier before the sunrise could even touch his face. In our own lives, we often do the exact same thing without realizing it. We mistake the heavy, exhausting strain of hypervigilance for authentic personal strength. We tell ourselves that if we do not remain emotionally guarded, it means we are weak or asking to be hurt. We believe that if we let our walls crumble for even a single evening, if we stop analyzing everyone's motives and predicting every disaster, we will be left completely exposed to the harsh elements of life. But this constant emotional shielding is not wisdom. It is the deep, aching friction that arises when we try to freeze our world in place, whispering to ourselves that everything must be completely predictable and controlled before our heart is allowed to be okay. One of the great insights of the Buddha was the understanding of how we build these internal fortresses out of our own fear. In timeless teachings, this pattern is described as a deep, desperate form of holding a relentless craving for things to remain certain, permanent, and safely tucked away from change. But life, by its very nature, is fluid, shifting and unpredictable, like the frost forming on the canyon stones or the dark rivers moving beneath the ice. Nothing stays completely still. No matter how many hours we lie awake tonight building defensive strategies in our minds, we cannot force the people around us or the events of tomorrow to lock themselves into an unyielding shape just to guarantee our peace. When we try to force a changing world to be completely unyielding, our internal landscape hardens. This emotional rigidity is what transforms ordinary human pain into deep, prolonged suffering. The first layer of difficulty we encounter: the unexpected rejection, the loss of a role, the sudden shift in a friendship, or the simple vulnerability of not knowing what comes next, is like being struck by a single arrow. It is a natural part of being a soft, living creature in a vast universe. But the weeks, months, or years we spend building a massive iron gate around that wound, the internal freeze that stops us from trusting again, the self-blame, and the hyper-vigilant scanning of the dark. This is how we strike ourselves with a second arrow. The first arrow is what life brings to our doorstep. The second arrow is the heavy, rusting cage we construct with our own minds. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. As you listen to the quiet rhythm of this room, what is the massive, rusted deadbolt you have thrown down inside your own chest to keep yourself from being hurt again? What is the old betrayal or the fear of failure that has made you lock your emotional gates so tightly that even the people who love you can no longer reach your warmth? Maybe it is a pattern of keeping your conversations safe and superficial, or a profound reluctance to share your true needs because you believe vulnerability is a dangerous weakness. Notice how much energy it takes to keep that heavy iron structure closed against the world. Notice the specific tightness it creates in your throat, the shallow quality of your breath, and the way it steals the natural, fluid ease of this evening. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that letting go does not mean you abandon your life or stop caring about the people who walk alongside you. True letting go means releasing the extra struggle. It means pouring the warm, gentle oil of awareness onto the seized joints of your own defense systems so that your heart can breathe again. It is the realization that you can protect your peace without turning your spirit into a tomb. You can care deeply about your boundaries without having to freeze your entire emotional world into solid ice. It is the courage to trust that you do not need to be completely unyielding tonight in order to be safe. Awareness is the quiet, spacious room that can look at the iron gate without becoming the iron. Right now, your mind may still be presenting you with anxious reasons to keep your guard up, trying to convince you that if you soften your posture, everything will fall apart. But you do not have to obey those thoughts. You do not have to live inside the fortress they build. You can simply observe the tension, the way Elder Wren watched the single drop of oil sink into the flaking orange rust, without panic and without judgment. A fearful thought is just a brief winter cloud passing through the vast sky of your consciousness. It is a visitor, not your master. It is an event, not your identity. Compassion begins when we stop treating our own protective patterns as a reason to hate ourselves. It is the soft willingness to look at your rigid shoulders and your aching jaw and say to yourself, "Of course you built this wall, you were trying to keep me safe when the world felt too cold." We do not need to break the gate down with a hammer of self-criticism. We do not need to fight our defenses with more anger. We only need to provide a quiet, spacious sanctuary where the hardened iron can gently warm up in the evening air, allowing the tight spaces to loosen at their own natural pace. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, bringing this ancient mountain path down into the specific physical sensations of your own body. We will learn how to practice this internal softening together, right here in the dark, without any pressure to achieve a perfect state of healing tonight. But for now, let yourself rest in the simple truth that you do not need to guard your heart against the mattress beneath you. The earth is wide enough and strong enough to bear the weight of your fortress while you sleep. If it feels right to you, let your attention drift completely away from the world of names, numbers, and logical explanations, allowing it to settle deeply into the heavy, unmoving reality of your physical body right now. You might find it comfortable to rest one of your hands gently upon the center of your chest, right over the space behind your breastbone, where that quiet, heavy stone has been residing all day long. Or perhaps it feels more supportive to leave your arms entirely loose at your sides, your fingers uncurled, your palms turned slightly upward in a soft gesture of absolute non-doing. There is no correct or incorrect way to hold your frame in this moment. You do not need to sit up in a rigid, cross-legged posture, and you do not need to mimic the flawless stillness of a stone statue. No one is watching you, no one is evaluating your progress, and there is no standard of spiritual success you are required to achieve tonight. Even if your mind is still producing small, anxious whispers, or if your chest still feels like it is locked behind a pane of frozen glass, you are completely welcome here exactly as you are. Even the simple act of noticing the coldness inside, without trying to violently smash it with your willpower, is a profound and beautiful form of awareness. Take a slow, unhurried breath in through your nose, simply noticing the cool, crisp quality of the night air as it travels down across the back of your throat and begins to expand the spaces around your lungs. And when you are ready, let that breath slip away through your lips with a long, soft, unrestricted sigh, letting your abdomen drop and your chest loosen into the mattress. There is no need to force this breath to be deeper or longer than it naturally wants to be. Just watch it happen. Observe how your body already knows exactly how to breathe itself, expanding and contracting in a quiet, timeless rhythm that has supported you through every difficult hour of your life, without you ever having to give it a single command. For just a few minutes tonight, you can resign from your position as the absolute guardian of your destiny. You can step down from the exhausting task of managing your survival and let the earth beneath your bed take over the full burden of holding your weight. Perhaps you can bring your awareness up to the tiny, delicate muscles that live around the corners of your eyes and across your forehead. If you notice a lingering warmth there, or a tight knot of concentration born from hours of trying to analyze your problems, imagine a cool, dark shadow gently passing over your face, soothing the skin and carrying away the friction of the daylight world. Now, let that soft release travel downward into your jaw. So many of our hidden griefs, our unshed tears, and our ancient self-protections find a home in the way we press our teeth together when we are trying to appear strong for other people. If it feels right, let your teeth separate just a fraction of an inch. Allow your tongue to drop away from the roof of your mouth and let your lower jaw hang loose, heavy, and completely unhinged. Feel how that single, small pocket of physical softening begins to send a quiet wave of ease down the sides of your neck, releasing the tight cords that have been bracing your head against the world all day long. As you lie here in the dim, protective sanctuary of your quiet room, let your mind bring forward just one specific thought, memory, or flat emotional pattern that has been repeatedly asking for your attention tonight. You do not need to go digging for the absolute largest or most terrifying trauma in your history. Simply look at whatever quiet shadow is currently lingering at the very surface of your awareness. It might be a recent disappointment, a feeling of being left out, or a heavy, nameless numbness that makes you feel entirely disconnected from the people around you. Do not try to push this pattern away. Do not try to fix it, and do not judge yourself for carrying it. We are not here to wage a war against your defenses or to force your heart to split open before it is ready. Instead, in the quiet, spacious theater of your imagination, let yourself look at this specific emotional weight through the lens of our story. See it not as a permanent defect in your soul, but as that dense, black block of water-soaked charcoal retrieved from Master Tan's earth kiln. Sense the physical quality of this object resting right behind your ribs. It is ice-cold to the touch, heavy as iron, and completely saturated with the stagnant moisture of your past resistance. For months, or perhaps for years, you have kept this charcoal buried deep under a layer of wet earth inside your mind, believing that by keeping it numb, by smothering your genuine grief, and refusing to let your tears fall, you were keeping yourself safe from being burned again. But look at the cost of this holding. Feel how the cold water within the wood has turned into a heavy, stagnant winter that dampens your capacity to feel real joy, real warmth, or real connection. Without any rush, and without forcing any sudden emotional breakthrough, imagine yourself gently lifting this dense, water-soaked block out of the dark, muddy soil of your subconscious. You are not trying to set it on fire, and you are not trying to destroy it. You are simply placing it flat upon a clean, dry stone terrace, exposing its black, saturated fibers to the natural movement of the open air. Let the slow, rhythmic flow of your current breath act like a gentle, warm evening wind that begins to blow across the surface of the wood. Watch what happens to the charcoal when it is no longer hidden in the dark earth. Even noticing the cold moisture beginning to evaporate from its pores is enough. The gold light of your own non-judgmental awareness is beginning to warm the frozen joints of the metal. The black soot is no longer a permanent stain. It is simply a texture that is ready to change its shape under the touch of the sky. In a moment, this story will carry us higher up the mountain trail, away from the dripping cedar ravine, to see what happens when the wood is met by a warm midnight wind in a roofless courtyard. But right now, there is absolutely nothing you need to accelerate. Healing is not a violent storm that shatters the dense wood. It is a quiet, patient drying out, a soft willingness to let your grief be held by the spaciousness of the present moment without calling it a mistake. You do not need to cry tonight to be healed, and you do not need to feel perfectly whole before you are allowed to close your eyes. You are entirely safe to simply be right here, breathing in the darkness, letting the heavy, waterlogged images dissolve into the quiet currents of the room. Your hands are empty, your chest is slightly wider, and you are permitted to let go of the struggle as we drift deeper into the night. The damp chill of that mountain spring eventually turned into the heavy, slow heat of a high alpine summer. In the months that followed his first evening at the earth kiln, Jiro had learned how to exist with less immediate physical rigidity. His jaw no longer throbbed with that constant, aching friction, and his hands had grown a little softer, less prone to curling into tight, defensive knots. Yet, a deeper, much more stubborn layer of emotional shielding still haunted his internal world. He had become hyper-vigilant about his own recovery. Instead of allowing his grief to move naturally, he spent his days analyzing his emotional progress under a microscope. He would monitor his heart constantly, tracking every flicker of sadness, judging himself whenever a wave of cold numbness returned, and trying to plan exactly how he would remain balanced and calm in the future. He had simply moved his habit of control from the outside world to his own inner landscape, demanding that his mind become perfectly peaceful before he would give himself permission to live. Recognizing this hidden, exhausting struggle, Master Tan told Jiro that it was time to leave the cedar ravine for a short while. He instructed the young man to journey higher up the trail, past the jagged stone cliffs to a high, windswept terrace where a small pottery shed sat nestled among a grove of wild plum trees. There lived Sister Kaya, an old nun who spent her days working with coarse, unglazed river clay. Jiro was tasked with carrying a large, dry reed basket to her and bringing back a specific set of shallow clay trays used for drying medicinal mountain roots in the open air. Jiro set out early in the morning, but as he climbed into the thinner air of the upper ridges, a sudden, heavy midsummer fog began to roll across the slopes. Within an hour, the green valley below completely vanished, swallowed by a wall of seamless, swirling white. The path became narrow and deceptive, hugging the sheer edge of a rocky ravine where water dripped invisibly through the mist. Jiro's chest tightened instantly. His breathing became shallow, catching in the back of his throat as his heart began to hammer against his ribs. He could not see more than 2 steps ahead of his sandals. Standing frozen in the heavy dampness, his mind immediately began to spin catastrophic stories. He imagined stepping off the hidden cliff into the abyss. He envisioned a sudden rockfall crushing him in the blindness of the cloud. He began to calculate all the ways he could lose his orientation and freeze on the ridge before anyone could find him. His intellect demanded to know exactly how the trail curved a mile ahead before he would find the courage to take another step. He tried to mentally force his way through the mountain, exhausting his inner energy by projecting his fears into the unseen distance, trying to defeat the fog through sheer mental preparation. For a long time he stood there, paralyzed by the illusion that he could think his way through a cloud, but the fog remained vast, heavy, and completely indifferent to his demands for certainty. Just as the familiar, cold stone of despair began to harden behind his breastbone, a low, rhythmic sound echoed through the white silence ahead. It was the steady, dry scraping of wood against stone, followed by the soft whistling of a high mountain wind passing through hollow clay. Following the sound with slow, hesitant steps, Jiro stumbled into the small clearing of the pottery terrace. The space was completely open to the sky, surrounded only by the gnarled, twisting branches of the plum trees. Standing in the center of this misty terrace, working at a low wooden bench, was Sister Kaya. She was a woman whose skin looked like fired earth, her grey hair cropped short, her hands coated in a thick layer of wet grey slip. She was currently smoothing the rim of a wide, coarse clay drying tray. The tray was rough, unpolished, and completely unglazed, its porous surface absorbing the damp moisture of the fog without swelling or cracking. Sister Mai did not look up when Jiro entered the clearing. She was entirely focused on the slow rotation of her wooden wheel, her thumbs pressing gently into the center of the spinning mud. Jiro, trembling from the cold and the terror of the cliff path, dropped his basket and spoke, his voice tight and uneven. "Sister Kaya, I have come from the lower ravine, but the trail is completely lost in the white cloud. I am paralyzed by how much I cannot see. And I am terrified that if I move, I will fall. How do you live up here where the horizon is constantly hidden? How do you keep your pottery from shattering when the weather changes so violently without warning?" Sister Kaya stopped the wheel. She rested her wet, grey-coated palms flat against the rough surface of the unglazed clay tray. She let the sound of the high wind rushing through the plum trees breathe between them for a long moment before she looked up at Jiro's pale, rigid face. She did not offer him a phrase of philosophy or a lecture on courage. Instead, she asked a very simple, immediate question. "Jiro, can you feel the texture of the stone beneath your sandals right now?" Jiro blinked, shifting his weight slightly. He looked down and saw that he was standing on a broad, flat shelf of grey bedrock at the edge of the terrace. "Yes," he said, "I can feel it. It is solid." "And can you see the edge of my wooden work table right in front of your chest?" she asked, pointing her thumb toward the thick pine bench. "Yes," Jiro replied. "I can see the table clearly." Sister Kaya smiled faintly, the dried clay on her cheeks wrinkling softly. "Then you have everything you need to navigate this entire mountain," she said. "Your suffering does not come from the fog, Jiro. It comes because you are trying to stand on a single stone while your mind is trying to walk a mile of unseen trail. You are standing here in my courtyard, but your spirit is miles away, trying to conquer the cliffs you haven't reached yet. You are demanding that the mountain reveal its ending to you before you are willing to trust the step you are currently taking. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the way we meet the weather inside our own hearts." Sister Kaya stood up, her movements unhurried and fluid. She reached over to a corner of the shed and lifted a small unfired clay jar that had been sitting in the damp shadow of the roof. It was still soft, wet, and easily impressionable. She placed it out in the middle of the open terrace, right where the high mountain wind and the wet mist could strike it directly. "Look at this wet clay, Jiro," she said softly, tracing the damp rim with her finger. "It does not build an iron wall to protect itself from the fog. It does not try to freeze its shape to resist the moisture of the sky. It is soft, porous, and completely open to the air. Because it is unglazed and unbaked, the moisture can pass straight through its walls without meeting an enemy. The clay does not break when the fog rolls in it, simply absorbs the dampness, remains yielding, and waits for the sun to return. It only shatters if it is thrown into a blazing furnace while it is still trying to trap its internal water behind a hardened exterior." Jiro stood perfectly still as the old potter's words vibrated through the cool air. A sudden, deep throb of recognition flared in his chest, a sensation that felt like warm water hitting a frozen field. He looked down at his own hands, which were still tightly clenched inside his sleeves, gripping his own forearms as if he were holding himself together by sheer physical force. He realized that his life since the Great Fire had been an endless attempt to bake his heart into an iron brick before the moisture of his grief could be processed. He had stopped burying the charcoal in the dirt, but he was still trying to harden his own clay against the sky. He was still treating his sadness as a dangerous flaw that had to be controlled and conquered before he could be safe. Sister Kaya reached out her grey-stained hand and gently tapped the center of Jiro's chest, right where the cold stone sat behind his ribs. "When you pick up your basket and walk back down the ridge tonight, Jiro," she whispered, "do not look for the gates of the valley. Do not look for the ending of the trail. Only look for the single stone that is currently meeting the sole of your sandal. When that rock is under your foot, it is the only piece of the universe you are required to live through. Let the fog be the fog. Let the cloud do what the cloud must do. It has no power to break your spirit if you stop hardening your heart into a wall to fight it." Jiro did not magically become a perfectly peaceful master in that courtyard. His heart still beat with a quiet, careful caution as he watched the white mist swirl through the plum trees. But as he lifted the heavy reed basket onto his shoulder, he made one small, subtle shift. He stopped his mind from leaping forward into the next hour. He stood at the edge of the terrace, took one deep, slow breath of the cold mountain fog, and allowed the damp air to fill his lungs completely without calling it an enemy. He did not try to force his fear to disappear, and he did not judge himself for feeling small in the vast white silence. He simply allowed the uncertainty to exist right alongside his breathing. He took his first step off the bedrock. He could not see where the path would turn 20 paces ahead. But as his sandaled foot pressed down onto the next hidden stone, he found that the earth was entirely solid beneath his weight. He did not look up into the blinding white horizon. He looked down at the single patch of dark soil currently holding his frame, took another breath, and moved forward one step, one rock, one exhalation at a time. The fog remained thick, mysterious, and heavy all the way down the long western ridge. But Jiro was no longer walking through a prison. He had stopped trying to solve the mountain before he walked it. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. Feel how much lighter your own chest becomes when you realize you only ever have to live through one single moment at a time. You do not have to carry the weight of next week, or next year, or even the next hour while you are lying here in the dark. You only need to be right here, on this single stone of tonight, letting the rest of the world remain hidden in the mist until it is time to meet it. When we look deeply into the mechanism of our own suffering, we begin to see that this internal hardening is not an accident. It is a highly intelligent, deeply ingrained defense mechanism created by a heart that has been bruised by the unpredictability of living. We look at the misty, unmapped stretches of our own future, or the painful memories of times we were left unprotected, and a quiet panic takes root behind our eyes. In a desperate attempt to ensure we are never caught off guard again, our intellect steps forward as a fierce guardian. It begins to spin endless webs of conceptual thought, trying to analyze every variable, replay every mistake, and anticipate every possible failure. We believe, with a profound and exhausting sincerity, that if we just hold ourselves rigidly enough, we can outmaneuver the storm. But notice the quiet, devastating cost of maintaining this constant inner shield. Have you ever noticed that the more hours you spend trying to mentally secure your life, the more fragile and exhausted you feel underneath? The mind constantly whispers that if we just worry a little longer, if we criticize our own shortcomings a little more sharply, we will finally arrive at a place where we are safe enough to relax. We begin to use self-judgment and shame as tools for self-improvement. We reprimand ourselves for feeling anxious, we scold our hearts for being sensitive, and we try to punish our vulnerabilities out of existence, hoping that a harder, colder version of ourselves will somehow be immune to pain. This is the exact moment where the mind begins to turn its own protective patterns into a rigid identity. We no longer just feel a passing wave of fear, we begin to define ourselves as an anxious person. We no longer just encounter a period of emotional numbness, we believe that we have become cold, broken, or permanently detached from the world. We wrap this heavy armor around our chests so tightly that it changes the way we breathe, turning every inhalation into a shallow, restricted struggle. We become terrified of what we would be if we simply laid down our weapons, unbolted the gate, and allowed ourselves to exist without an active defense system. We mistake the burning, exhausting friction of our own hyper-vigilance for the vital spark of life itself. One of the great, liberating insights of the Buddha was the clear separation between the natural events of life and our internal resistance to them. He illuminated the truth that our experience is made of two entirely different layers. The first layer consists of the inescapable realities of being a soft, living creature in a vast and changing universe, the sudden endings, the physical fatigue, the unexpected clouds that roll over the ridge, and the simple fact that we cannot control how other people think or act. This is the first pain. It is a natural condition of existence, fluid and temporary like the midsummer rain falling through the plum trees. The second layer is what our own mind constructs around that reality. It is the invisible wall of resistance that insists this should not be happening. It is the internal freeze that demands the world must be entirely certain and safe before we are willing to let our guard down. It is the voice of self-blame that tells us our suffering is a personal failure, or that we must fix our entire history before we are worthy of peace. This second layer is what turns a passing moment of difficulty into a chronic state of suffering. We cannot always prevent the first pain, we cannot banish the fog from the mountain trail, and we cannot force life to be entirely gentle with us. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that we can learn to stop feeding the second pain. We can stop slamming the heavy iron deadbolt shut against our own experience. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. Think of how this mechanism is operating within the quiet space of your bedroom right now. The first layer may simply be the reality that your body is tired, but your eyes are still awake in the dark. That is a neutral, physical condition of the present moment. But notice how quickly the second layer arrives: the mental calculations of how many hours remain before morning, the frustration with your brain for refusing to slow down, and the anxious rehearsal of how exhausted you will feel tomorrow. Notice that the quiet darkness of the room is not what is causing your chest to tighten. It is the story about the wakefulness that is creating the heat in your forehead. The suffering is not born from the night, it is born from your demand that the night look differently. True peace is not the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a magical static state where you will never encounter an anxious thought or a painful memory again. If you are waiting for your outer life to become completely smooth, or for your inner mind to become perfectly wallless before you give yourself permission to rest, you will be waiting forever. Peace is not a destination at the end of a clear path. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the capacity to stand completely still on the single stone beneath your feet, knowing that the fog is thick and the trail is unmapped, while saying to your own heart, "I do not know what is coming next, and I do not need to know. I am solid right here." What happens when you stop treating every defensive thought as an absolute command? What happens when a wave of self-protection arises in your chest, and instead of reinforcing the wall, you simply look at it with a soft, spacious awareness? In that single moment of recognition, the iron begins to warm. You are no longer the prisoner inside the fortress, and you are no longer the heavy deadbolt frozen by its own rust. You become the vast, hollow space of the reed that allows the water and the sediment to pass through without being broken by the current. You become the quiet observer of the fear, and because you are the space that holds the fear can no longer consume your identity. You do not have to cure your hyper-vigilance tonight. The intense desire to fix your overthinking is often just another subtle form of control, another way of telling yourself that who you are in this moment is inadequate. Let your mind be as loud or as complicated as it wants to be for a few moments. Let the anxious thoughts circle like distant winds outside the orchard, but let your body drop completely beneath them. Let your awareness settle deep into the low, heavy rhythm of your belly, far below the noisy, frantic traffic of your intellect. In a moment, this wisdom will come even closer to the specific choices you face when you open your eyes tomorrow morning. We will see how this ancient perspective of the hollow reed and the single stone applies directly to the modern rhythms of your everyday life, to the messages that go unanswered, the pressures of your daily labor, and the moments where you feel guilty for simply needing to rest. But as we prepare to bring this teaching home, there is absolutely no conclusion you need to reach, and no breakthrough you need to force. Let the sounds of these words wash over you, like a warm midsummer rain, leaving your heart a little softer, a little wider, and completely permitted to release its guard. Now let this ancient wisdom of the mountain terrace move quietly down into the specific rooms and routines of your modern everyday life. The water-soaked charcoal and the porous, unglazed clay tray are not mere images from a distant country, they are the exact emotional forces moving within your chest. When you open your eyes in the early morning, and when you place your phone on the nightstand at the end of an exhausting day. We do not listen to these parables to escape our current world, but to learn how to walk through its hyper-connected demands without letting our hearts freeze into solid blocks of ice. Think of how frequently you find yourself burying that damp charcoal deep under a layer of artificial smiles during an ordinary afternoon. Perhaps it happens when you are sitting at your desk, surrounded by the bright hum of computers and the sharp voices of colleagues. You receive a piece of news that brings a sudden heavy ache to your chest, a quiet loss, a boundary crossed, or a sudden reminder of an old wound that never quite closed. Your natural instinct is to let a wave of soft sadness move through your body, but the speed of the world around you does not feel safe enough to hold your vulnerability. In a flash of panic, you throw down a heavy blanket of emotional numbness. You tighten your throat, swallow the lump rising in your windpipe, and force your face into a pleasant, untroubled expression. You tell yourself that you are being professional, that you are being strong, but inside, you have simply buried a hot ember beneath cold mud, locking the moisture of your true feelings into a dense, suffocating weight. Maybe you recognize this rigid tightening when you are waiting for a communication that never seems to arrive. You send a text or an email that exposes a small piece of your genuine heart, and then you wait. The minutes turn into hours, and the silence from the other side begins to feel like a heavy, suffocating fog. Your mind instantly begins to spin catastrophic stories to protect you from the pain of rejection. It replays your words, analyzing every syllable, judging your choice to be open, and mapping out 100 scenarios where you are humiliated or abandoned. You check your device every few minutes, looking for reassurance, demanding that a single digital notification act as a key to unlock your lungs. But notice the paradox. The reassurance you seek from the outside cannot dry the waterlogged clay inside. Even if the text arrives, the relief is only a brief pause before your mind finds the next uncertainty to guard against. Have you felt this exhaustion when you lie awake at midnight, looking at the silent ceiling, feeling a profound and aching guilt for simply needing to rest? We live in a culture that treats human life like a furnace that must constantly burn at maximum heat, measuring our worth entirely by what we produce, achieve, and display to the world. You look at the curated, polished exhibitions of the people around you, and a quiet shame whispers that you are falling behind, that you are not enough, or that your quiet, everyday life is a failure because it is plain and uncelebrated. You want to close your eyes, your bones are crying out for a moment of genuine surrender, but a restless thought stands over your bed like a harsh master, telling you that you have not earned the right to sleep until you have solved every problem and fixed every flaw. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that you do not have to earn your rest. Rest is not a reward you receive after your mind becomes perfectly silent and your life becomes completely free of trouble. It is the natural, spacious ground upon which your existence is built. You can care deeply about your work, your relationships, and your future without gripping them so fiercely that your fingers begin to bleed from the strain. Tomorrow, when you step back into the noise of the daylight world, this peace is practiced not by escaping your responsibilities, but through very small, poetic shifts in your attention. When a wave of anxiety or an oncoming shadow of sadness hits your chest, you do not have to immediately force it into a box. You do not have to pretend to be okay, and you do not have to use shame to fix your heavy heart. You can choose to do what Jiro did in the thick mountain mist. You can stop. You can take one deep, conscious breath before you react, before you answer, and before you check your screen for safety. A single breath before you speak a defensive word, or before you dive into a spiral of overthinking. is an act of supreme spiritual discipline. In that tiny, unhurried pause, you are refusing to strike yourself with the second arrow. You are acknowledging the first pain, the coldness of the fog, the discomfort of the uncertainty, but you are refusing to bury it in the damp earth of your body. You are allowing yourself to be like Sister Kaya's unglazed clay tray, completely porous, letting the weather of the day pass straight through your awareness without meeting an unyielding wall. You are remembering that not every anxious thought is an absolute truth, and not every heavy feeling is a command that you must obey. You can live through an uncertain day one single stone at a time. If you do not know how a relationship will turn out, or how a project will end, or where your life will be a year from now, you do not have to exhaust your spirit trying to mentally map the entire forest. The fog cannot break you if you stop demanding that it reveal the valley. You only need to tend to the single patch of earth currently beneath your sandals. If you can be fully present with the taste of your tea, or the sound of the rain against the window, or the simple weight of your feet walking across the floor, you already possess everything required to remain steady. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet sanctuary of this room, realize that the day you left behind is entirely finished. The conversations have reached their natural conclusions, the tasks have taken their current shapes. There is absolutely nothing you can fix, rewrite, or secure between this hour and the dawn. The world is fully capable of continuing its long, slow turning without your constant management. You can let the water-soaked charcoal drop from your hands, allowing the black soot to wash away in the quiet dark. Your only calling in this moment is to let your frame become heavy, to let your chest become wide, and to permit your mind to drift effortlessly into the deep, unguided spaces of rest. In a moment, this journey will bring us to the final, stillest part of the night, where the stories and the insights dissolve completely into the quiet landscape of your sleep. You do not need to memorize these lessons, and you do not need to carry the weight of the pottery shed into your dreams. Just let your awareness become as open and roofless as the mountain terrace, letting the day fade away like a harmless echo in the midnight air. The room has grown completely still now, the deep, velvet shadows of the late hour stretching long and soft across the floorboards. Outside, the great world is quietly closing its eyes, the distant sounds of traffic and life fading into an absolute murmur, like water sinking deep into the dark mountain earth. Through the pane of your window, the pale silver moonlight falls across the room, perfectly motionless, unblinking, asking nothing from the space it touches. Let your body drop just a fraction deeper into the support of your bed, feeling the heavy, dependable warmth of your blanket as it cradles your frame. There is no longer any need to guide your breathing, no longer any need to count the inhalations or measure the depth of your chest. Just let your lungs move in their own natural, quiet rhythm, a soft, effortless tide that flows in and out of your body, like a warm summer breeze rustling through the gnarled branches of a plum orchard at midnight. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The heavy, unyielding slate of your daily struggles has been set down on the floor of this room, and its surface is now completely blank, undisturbed by the frantic carvings of your intellect. The long, unmapped trail of tomorrow does not need to be walked before the sun rises. Let the fog remain thick upon the high ridges, let the future remain beautifully hidden in the white mist, and let every unresolved question rest quietly in the dark without an answer. The universe is wide enough and kind enough to hold all of your uncertainties while you sleep. The people you worry about, the mistakes you have been replaying, the endless calculations of whether you are doing enough, all of them can be left on the threshold of this evening, resting quietly on the coarse, porous clay of the present moment. You do not need to carry a single brick of that fortress across the border into your dreams. Let your jaw soften completely. allowing the lower teeth to drop away from the upper teeth by a tiny, weightless space. Release the tight, invisible cords at the corners of your mouth and behind your ears, letting the deep, accumulated friction of the day melt away into the pillow. Let the skin across your forehead uncoil, becoming smooth, wide, and entirely spacious, like a dark, unprinted parchment resting in a quiet temple room. There are no roles you must perform tonight, no expectations you must fulfill, and no self-criticisms you must endure before you are considered worthy of peace. Your hands are entirely empty now. Your fingers are uncurled, loose and warm against the sheets, no longer gripping the heavy tools of your labor, no longer straining to hold back the hidden rivers of your heart. The old fire has gone quiet, and the night is simply vast, cool, and infinitely safe. The wisdom we have explored is no longer a set of words or a lesson to be analyzed. It has become a physical sensation of warmth, spreading outward from the center of your chest. It is the feeling of a heavy, frozen weight finally turning into soft, breathable air. In the hidden spaces behind your breastbone, that dense, water-soaked block of charcoal is no longer buried in the cold, wet mud. It is resting under the open sky, and the warm midnight wind is gently carrying away its dark, saturated density. Watch as the heavy black wood begins to dissolve into tiny flakes of weightless, silver-gray ash. The ash does not fight the current. It does not try to maintain a rigid shape. It simply surrenders its form to the dark air, floating upward, drifting harmlessly over the plum trees, returning to the vast expanse of the mountain without a single trace of resistance. What was once a crushing burden has become as light as a sigh. You are returning home tonight to the quiet, spacious awareness that has been waiting for you all along beneath the noisy traffic of your thoughts. This awareness does not panic when the clouds roll in, it does not feel behind, and it does not use shame to protect itself from the world. It is simply the silent, unroofed courtyard that holds the fog, the rain, the moonlight, and the slow, rhythmic beating of your heart. You can rest deeply within this sanctuary. You can let your identity dissolve into this stillness. You do not need to fix your numbness or force your heart to heal before you are permitted to close your eyes. The very vulnerability you were terrified would destroy you is the fluid path that is currently carrying you into a deep, unguarded rest. As the cadence of this voice grows slower and more distant, matching the heavy, hypnotic architecture of your natural sleep, let the remaining images fade away like morning mist over a quiet river. You do not need to remember the canyon kiln, the unglazed clay tray, or the steps of the trail. Just let yourself float down into the dark, nurturing waters of sleep, trusting that your spirit knows exactly how to restore its own warmth when you finally stop guarding your heart against the sky. The room is quiet, the blanket is soft, and the silence is absolute. There is nothing left for you to manage. There is nowhere else you are required to go. You are safe enough right now to let go of the last thread of control, allowing yourself to sink into the weightless, untroubled dark. And if the deep, healing peace you have been trying to force into existence was never a destination ahead of you, but the quiet, open space that remains when you finally stop running from your own sorrow.